Answers. Senator McKim.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I move that the Senate take note of Senator Brandis's answer to the question I asked him in relation to the Australian Citizenship Amendment Bill, and I do note that Senator Brandis is now fleeing the chamber because he knows he hasn't got a leg to stand on in relation to the extreme sophistry in the answers that he gave to the Senate. The question he was very clearly asked by the Greens was on what basis does he believe it's acceptable to strip citizenship from Australian nationals without providing for that decision to be made by the courts or tested in the courts before it is made. And of course Senator Brandis, in his answer, attempted to convince the Senate that the premise on which that question was based is incorrect. Well, in fact it is anything but incorrect. In fact it is absolutely accurate to suggest that, in fact, without a court finding, the government can effectively strip citizenship from an Australian national in relation to, as long as that, the actions of that national meet the criteria set out in the Act as proposed to be amended. Now, if the Greens are wrong about this, Professor George Williams is wrong about it too, Mr Deputy President, because I'll quote from Professor Williams in an article published by the ABC today, which reports Professor Williams as saying this, and I quote, "It's still possible under this legislation for the government to unilaterally find that someone should have their citizenship stripped." And further, Professor Williams went on to say that can happen without a court finding. Now, that was the premise of the question that Senator Brandis was asked today. And of course, Senator Brandis tried to rely on sophistry, as I said, when he argued in his answer that in fact it is the citizens themselves who are renouncing their own citizenship by virtues of the action they are taking. But of course what Senator Brandis, the step he is missing, is that someone has to make a determination about whether the actions or the alleged actions of the Australian national involved meet the criteria set out in the Act. And who's going to make that decision? Well, the minister's going to make that decision, unless the minister wants to wash his hands of that responsibility like Pontius Pilate and delegate it down to his or her department or to his or her intelligence agency. So what we've got is a situation here where this government, as I might add have previous governments, continually erode the fundamental civil and human rights of ordinary Australian people, the civil and human rights that many of our fathers, our grandfathers, our mothers and our grandmothers have fought and died for so long to protect and enhance. And this government, in the name of political expediency, driven by political expediency, in the name of counter-terrorism, are continuing to erode those fundamental rights. And that is why this country needs a more strategic and holistic assessment of the long-term impact on civil and human rights of this 10-year-long, actually 15-year-long tranche of legislation that has come before this parliament since the September 11 attacks. We've seen multiple police power multiple occasions where police powers have been broadened. We have seen multiple occasions when the powers of intelligence agencies have been broadened. We've seen it time and time again, and yet last time there was a strategic look at this was the Counter-terrorism white paper in 2010, when no one had ever heard of ISIS. I think it's fair to say, Mr Deputy President, that violent extremism has changed a fair bit in the last 5 years since the Counter-terrorism white paper. I think it's fair to say that things have moved on a bit. I think it's fair to say that Australians deserve to have a government that takes this issue seriously. And yes, we do need to look carefully at how we protect our people, but my goodness me, we also need to make sure that we are not unnecessarily eroding the kind of civil and human rights that people like my grandfathers went to war and died to protect and enhance.
Question is that the